Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Sacred Space podcast. My name is Gina Stockton, and I am so excited to share just some fun things that have been happening. We have not been doing this very long. It's been maybe a couple of months, and we've had well over 1,300 downloads of the podcast. People from over, I think, 40 states, about 12 countries have all downloaded and are listening, and it's so fun to see what God's doing. So I just want to thank you. I really haven't done any marketing, and yet it's really cool to see. So thank you so much for subscribing, for downloading, and I just want to encourage you that you are the best marketing. So if you are encouraged and feel like this is something that other people could benefit from, would you just let people know, post it on your stories, put it on Facebook, and share with your friends. Just spread the word, because this is a ministry. This is for people to connect with Jesus in a different way, a deeper way, to hear stories that they can relate to, that make them not feel alone, and maybe give them hope in whatever situation they might find themselves. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I also want to share a couple of quick things. The Sacred Space podcast is supported by Stockton Ministries, which is a nonprofit 501c3, and we now officially have a donate button on our website. Yay! So if you want to support this podcast and the other projects and resources that are coming out of Stockton Ministries, you can go to my website, ginastockton.com, or inthesacredspace.com, and in the top right-hand corner, there is a donate button, and the link is also in our episode notes, so that would be amazing. Speaking of projects, we received a grant not that long ago for the Dwell Project. The Dwell Project, if you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you've probably stumbled on our Dwell episodes. They are intended as scripture meditation, guided scripture meditation, and they are just a time to sit and make space to breathe and really let the Word of God sink in deep, to really have a moment to hear God's voice and to allow the Holy Spirit to not just read past a scripture, but to let it come in and really take root in our hearts and our minds. And we received a small grant to help us to produce an EP of dwells. So we will be recording that. We're entering into pre-production in the next couple of weeks, and that will be recording, and some of those dwells will be episodes on the Sacred Space podcast, and some of them will be available as an EP in the iTunes store. So we are so excited, can't wait, and we will keep you posted. Well, today's guests are Brian and Linda Seitz. Brian and Linda are dear, dear friends. They have incredible ministry to marriages. They've been married 30 years, I believe. They were in an unequally yoked marriage for 7 of those years. Brian is a retired police captain. Linda is a life coach. And together they have done lay counseling. They have developed and taught a class for marriages in crisis called Rebuild Your Marriage. They are amazing people who God has used tremendously to really save dozens of marriages through their ministry, through who they are, through their classes, through their mentorship. And they have a really unique perspective on marriage and on relationship. And it was a really fun, interesting conversation. I know I learned a lot of things, and I really hope that you will be encouraged, that you will maybe learn how to stand, if you're in an unequally yoked marriage, how to stand in that place differently, how to have that sacred space with Jesus, but still love your spouse well. And, or if you know someone who is, you just know how to love them and be a friend and how to support them in that journey and be patient as Jesus pursues them. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of Sacred Space. Thanks for being here.
We're so happy to be here.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So, Brian and Linda, I would love to start with your testimony, your story. Like, how'd you come to Jesus?
Yeah. It's interesting. We moved into this brand new neighborhood in South Orange County, and although we were married in the Catholic Church, fast forward, how many years? Like 7 years after that, we moved into this new neighborhood and didn't really know anyone in our community. And but it was a street full of dirt, front yards and freshly poured driveways, and this woman and two little girls came walking down the street, and they were the same ages as our girls at the time. And I thought, wow, I need to get to know that person, but I didn't really know why, and what was going to become of it. She, very shortly after meeting us and, doing play dates and sidewalk chalk and popsicles, she started asking me about God and what I thought about God and what I thought about Father God and what I thought about church. And, I was raised in a church where it wasn't so much fun to go. So yeah. When she started saying it's fun to go to church, I thought she's a little loopy. I don't know what she's talking about, because I just have never had that experience before. And she said, come with me. I want you to come with me. Your girls would have fun. Let's go. And so I started going, and, at the time, Brian was a young police officer, so rarely would he have Sundays off.
Yeah.
So it wasn't unnatural for me to go to church or anywhere without him and take the kids, because that's just kind of what we did. We had our own life going on. And so I would say it was maybe 3 months later, it was Easter of 1993, and it was at Saddleback Church, and Pastor Rick that day talked about freedom and the most beautiful message on freedom. And, I hadn't realized how unfree I felt until I heard that message, and I was able to really grasp that truth and understand that God was not just this big guy upstairs kind of shaking his finger at you.
Yeah.
But he had a son that he gave, and that wants to have a friendship and a wholesome life with you, and that there's so much more. And so I grabbed every verse that was being handed to me, and I would go home and I would teach myself how to look it up in the Bible, because I did not know how to read the Bible. And so I taught myself, and then that passion just kind of, I kind of pushed that new passion into my kids, but Brian wasn't really ready yet.
Yeah, I would say in my mind, at least. So my mind and reality don't always mesh. But in my mind, I grew up going to church. We went, as a family, we went to a small church in Los Angeles, and they had their own school. I went to that school. And so therefore, just by that existence and that participation, I therefore was a believer and knew everything there was to know. So when I think I remember when Linda first said she was going to church, I was fine with that. That didn't bother me at all. It's not that I was a God hater or an atheist or even agnostic. I believed that there was a higher power. I had no problem with the concept and belief in Jesus. But I only had one worldview on what that is. And so the first time I went to that experience with Linda, I was pretty sure my wife had joined a cult.
Really?
Yeah. Well, it was in a tent
at the time.
And I thought, what in the world have I done by not being more of a part of what... Because now Linda...
You could have protected her from
Yeah,
this.
Linda and the girls, I don't think Brett wasn't barely a thing yet. If he was,
he wasn't,
What have I allowed Linda and the girls? And so it just took a while for me to understand, and so I started going with her to understand it, and then it became less cultish and just more. I don't know that I have a good adjective for it, but it just was a little sticky sweet for me. I missed their tradition. I remember going at a Christmas service, I think, and commenting when they finally played, pick the oldest hymn you can think of, and they used to have the little words under there, circa 1597, and I'm like, now that's a Christmas song.
Right.
These ones written in, 1992, that's not a Christmas song, that's pop.
Yeah.
And so it was just a whole mindset, and that was my mindset for a long time until I got to the point where I really began to not like it. And I didn't like it for a number of reasons. I didn't understand the relational aspect of Christianity in a significant way. I just understood that this is a big book. Try to read it when you can. This is, morality and philosophy. Cling to that, and you're good.
Yeah.
And I then also began to resent Linda a little bit because I didn't think there was any reasoning with her. And it felt like she was almost cheating on me. Not with a person, but with an entity. Because when our time together was so rare and valuable, especially prior to that when we were brand new parents, we were tag team parents, just trying to keep the kids going and pay the bills. So we never even got to visit with each other. And we'd finally got a life where now we had a little time to be together, and she was often leaving me to go enjoy this other life that I didn't want to be a part of.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's probably really important for people to hear, especially those that may be in a unequally yoked marriage, whether it's the husband or the wife. And I think so often in the church we think of the Christian who's unequally yoked and how hard that is for them, but we rarely think of the impact it is on the other side of that,
Right.
And so there's this burden of, we just need to pray for them, but not really understanding. I think that's really significant for you to be able to articulate what that felt like,
Yeah, I don't feel like I've never been a perfect husband, right? I've never gonna be that. But I don't think I was a bad one. Even in some of those times, I wasn't doing a lot of the things like in when Linda and I counsel people, we get to hear a lot of really bad stuff. And so it was weird. I felt, very much worldly in that, well, I'm a nice person.
Yeah.
And so since I'm a nice person and I'm not cheating on my wife and I'm pretty respectful of her, I have some downtime when I mess up, that she should be, and it wasn't an honor me thing. It was, no, this is what we're going to do because we're a couple.
Right.
And it just wasn't performing to that level. Our marriage wasn't.
And I think I kind of shocked him because we started dating when I was 15 and he was 17. So we knew each other.
Know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
We'd known each other for a long, long time. And I'm like the classic introvert. So I usually am pretty quiet about decisions. I usually had no problem letting him make the final decision on things and this and that. So when I said, no, I'm actually a Christian, I'm following Jesus, I'm like, this Bible thing, it's real. And the Christian music, it's not going to stop in our home. And the kids are going to be in the choir. And like, this is what I think I shocked him because I'd never been quite firm like that on anything. Like, I never really needed to be firm on anything. But, there was something about it that I was just like, nope, I can't go back. And I do admit, like, it was such a tough time that for a lot of the time I didn't really want to be at home because I didn't want to enter into those conversations. And I didn't want him to see me reading the Bible because I didn't want any sarcasm. And I joined every Bible study, every group, went to every kids choir practice and everything. And so I did not make church look very good to him. And, but at that time it was like, that's all I knew. It was almost like it was my coping mechanism.
Right. Well, there's a couple of things I think you're dealing with. Like there's a hunger in you you're starting to develop this like hunger for the word and hunger for this new relationship. And then, like you said, there's the tension that you're trying to avoid too.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
But then you're still present and want to be, so that you're wrestling with all those things, how to be the wife, how to be a Christian, how to be a mom, how to, all of those things. And meanwhile, you're over here kind of going, okay.
Yeah, I felt like I was working my tail off because I was. And the little bit of time we had together, I valued tremendously. And suddenly she's always gone. And that was frustrating for me.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I I loved that the kids were in the church choir. I loved Little Lambs. I was proud. Like they would have this show at Knott's Berry Farm, and I can remember my, just sort of filling up with pride. Those are my baby girls up there singing. Look how cute they are. But I didn't understand this Bible study thing.
Yeah.
I didn't understand. I don't know that I saw you change for the bad. It wasn't that. It was just, I didn't understand.
Uncomfortable.
And there was nobody there. We weren't equipped in our marriage at that time to sit down and have that intellectual conversation to satisfy me. Doesn't mean you needed to do that. That just means that's what my mind needed.
Right.
Yeah.
And there was really nobody in my sphere of influence that could help me understand that. I had people at work that were detractors. I had other people in my life that were detractors. And then a few people at work started to pop up that also were Christians. And I began to talk to them and try to just sort of figure that out, because for whatever reason, it was easier for me to ask them questions and hear their hard answers than it was to go to my wife.
Wow.
And maybe that was my
interesting.
pride. I don't have an answer for that. But then the other phenomenon, there was a guy in particular, Steve, who we worked graveyard together. So I was up all night with Steve in my car, and then I'd sleep all day, and I'd see Linda and the kids for 2 hours, and then I'd go back to work. And Steve was a strong Christian. And when you're in a car with somebody for 10, 12 hours a night, it's amazing the things you'll talk about.
Yeah.
Things that I probably don't even share with my wife, not because I don't want to, but when you're with your wife, there's the comfortable silence sometimes. And when you're with a new guy, there's no comfortable silence. Yeah. Somebody's always filling in the noise. And so Steve really got me thinking. And I remember being frustrated with Steve, but not with you, because Steve one time said, Brian, you are a nice guy, and you do have good Christian morals, but you're not a Christian. So morals do not a Christian make, although Jesus is certainly glad that you're using his morals. Right? and Steve probably said it much nicer than that, but I remember we were at the gas pumps, and I thought, I'm going to punch you in the nose. It's one of those things.
I like Steve.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And then, and early on, I kind of made it worse, because I thought, well, if I find a small group that was made up of police officers, then that will be the answer. Then we can go to a Bible study that has police officers in it, and then he would be comfortable.
Right.
And then he would become a Christian, because I thought at that point it was all on me.
Right.
I was responsible for surrounding him with all of this, good stuff. And that small group went sideways real quick within an hour, I think.
Yeah, that blew up bad. That was like that cartoon cigar that poof, there's
so
black
funny.
all over your face.
So what's interesting about that is you're feeling, just as a new Christian and not even understanding, you're feeling all this pressure that you need to somehow manipulate the situation to convince Brian that he needs to become a Christian. Meanwhile, God's already taken care of it. He's sitting him and Steve
Right.
every night for 12 hours, right? And that's a lesson we all have to learn, not just about, an unequally yoked marriage, is when can we get to that place of actually trusting that God is God.
Right.
And we aren't. And with the same kind of intentional, intimate, relentless pursuit of me, of you, he's going to do the same thing for those that we love, right?
Right.
It's but somehow it takes a while for us to understand. So what changed? Like when did things finally shift?
I feel like it was during MOPS. We had
Which is Mothers of Preschoolers.
Mothers of Preschoolers at Saddleback Church. We had a beautiful group of like 100 women. They invited in Titus women into their group that were obviously women who were much further ahead in parenting and marriage than we were. And so they would walk around the tables and ask for prayer requests and how can I help you? Or maybe kind of seek out one woman per week that was really having a difficult time. And she helped me through a lot of things, a lot of parenting things, a lot of medical things that I was questioning. But then finally when I asked her about how do you run a marriage when one of you is a Christian and one of you isn't? And I'll never forget, she asked me what my schedule looked like. And I told her all of the things I was doing, MOPS and Bible studies, and then I was babysitting for Bible studies, and then I was serving in the nursery on the weekend, and then I would go to a service on the weekend. And she said, I think that you're making church look really bad to your husband. And she said, God would never tell you not to grow in him, but he might tell you to not get so far ahead that if your husband did come to Christ, that he would feel like he couldn't catch up.
Wow.
And, I am a visual learner. So when I had that picture in my head of me being so far ahead, which I wasn't, but I was going in that direction. Yeah. I was ready to leave him behind.
Yeah.
For the pursuit of Christ, because, you're passionate and you want to move forward like that. But I think that, God places really wise people in your life at the perfect time.
Yeah.
And she stopped me in my tracks. And
It's good.
then started recognizing where I needed to pull back, and that I could study the Bible really anytime I wanted to. I could listen to K-Wave, which I did a lot, but I didn't always have to be gone. And
Right.
so one weekend, you asked me not to go
Yeah.
to church.
Yeah, no, I was frustrated. I wanted to have a family day, and you kept taking, what I perceived to be the family away. And so I just said, I need you to make a choice, and I need you to choose me today. And you said, okay. And I was surprised. And I was thankful. Yeah. There were so many things going on, and probably a lot of it I wasn't aware of, but somewhere in there was another person talking to me, not about, and this isn't to say Steve was doing this. Steve was just talking to talk. But I began to feel like a project. And then somebody else came into my life, Mitch, and I wasn't a project to Mitch. I was a friend. And he would answer my questions intellectually in a way that complemented Steve's.
Yeah.
I want to make it clear that I'm not down on Steve in any way. Steve was fantastic. But Mitch would satiate another thirst that I had, and that began to make it okay for me to pursue this. And then we had that little weekend where you were going to leave me yet again, and I said, no, don't. I need you here, and you did that, and I felt honored, especially as I look back on it. I felt honored. And then I also began to have my own curiosities and trying to figure out how to deal with those. And so, yeah, that first Bible study that you brought me to was an absolute disaster. But then probably 6 months to a year after that, we went to another one, and that was of my choosing. And now that feels a little arrogant to say it like that. But it was something that gave me comfort rather than having me feel ambushed.
Yeah.
And I really didn't mind discussing who I thought Jesus was and learning from other people and having them point me to certain directions. I minded not being a part of the conversation. And so as a husband whose wife was doing all those activities, I felt like I wasn't part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So suddenly we found a small group of friends that we began to meet with, and they let me kind of be a jerk. I hope I wasn't a jerk, but they let me ask kind of jerkish questions and answer them kindly, in love, pointed references. Sometimes they said, gosh, Brian, how is that really a question that has an answer? It was just sort of people that were ahead of me in a lot of areas, and wisdom was certainly a part of that. And their knowledge of all things Bible and Jesus were significant.
Yeah.
Well, what a beautiful picture, too. I mean, isn't that what we should be? To be someone who would accept you and love you exactly where you're at.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
So there's something really fascinating just listening to your story that I've never really thought of at all until just now. But marriage was God's idea. Adam and Eve, it's not good that man should be alone. A man would leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, right? And it's this picture of partnership and this joining. And you were equally yoked outside of the Lord until you became a Christian, and suddenly there's this tension and this thing you're having to kind of fight against. And there's something really powerful about the wisdom of your friend to see that. Because, I've been walking with Jesus for a really long time. I've had a lot of friends. I've been in a lot of Bible studies. I've been in a lot of women's ministries and seen a lot of unequally yoked marriages and seen the toll that takes. And it's easy, I think, as believers to put all of this, oh, poor Christian wife or husband and your spouse doesn't know Jesus, and that must be so hard for you. But rarely do we really attend to or are willing to pay attention to what is it like for the spouse, and what does it look like to love them well where they're at. And I love the fact that, like we mentioned earlier, God was taking care of your husband. That wasn't your job. And he was doing that by sending wisdom and people in your life to speak truth and love and wisdom. He was doing that by sending men in your life, Brian, to speak truth and love and to love you where you were at. And then I just love that picture. I don't know if I'm even articulating it well, but I think there's something really beautiful and profound about the significance of marriage and that partnership, the significance of what that looks like when it's out of whack spiritually.
Yeah.
And if we can have the patience and the love and the long-suffering to stand and wait and trust what God can do in that.
Yeah, I think that's great, Gina. And I think to build on that even maybe a tiny bit more, when the analogy of the equally yoked process is given, as painful as it is for, in our perspective now, the Christian, whether it's the man or woman, that yoke that the oxen wear, it pinches both directions.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes we need to remember, and that's a counseling point that we talk about. It's a little uncomfortable, but sometimes we ask people, do you think it's possible to volunteer at church too much?
Yeah.
And oftentimes the answer they'll give us is no.
Yeah.
And we have to say, well, maybe it is. And let us help explain to you how that can be. We're not trying to disrespect God. We're not trying to tell you that God's not important. We're trying to tell you that this yoke is pinching you, but it's pinching him or her as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
Because that yoke, it's just a solid piece of wood in the analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in an unequally yoked marriage, the Christian has to be really careful too about making certain that they are humble, because you tend to accept Christ, and for whatever reason, your humanness kind of takes over, and you're like, I'm right.
Yeah.
This is the way it is.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry that you're not following this, but you're wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that, you had a good point where, God sends people into our lives. 2 men were talking to Brian, which was, it turned a corner for him. It helped him to kind of understand. And it was not me who was going to teach Brian. And I knew that very clearly that it wasn't going to be me. But also something that changed during that time was my prayer life, because, we tend to pray to make ourselves comfortable. So it's like, Lord, please make Brian a Christian. Lord, please make him want to read the Bible. Lord, please make him want to go to church. And, I'll tell you, that same Titus woman, I think she was probably an angel, because she hit me at the perfect times. But also, I was at the point where I was ready to listen to it. Because we talked to a lot of unequally yoked marriages, and there seems to be a sense of almost sassiness.
Yeah.
Well, it's too bad that he's not doing it, but, he's supposed to be the leader of my home, and he's not, so here I go, and you hear this, you just hear this attitude, and it's like... I was really blessed to be around women who also really loved their husbands. Yes, their husbands were Christians and they were leaders, but they were still very respectful. And so that same Titus woman, I can remember one day just breaking down with her and saying, like, this is all, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how I'm going to live this life. I don't know how to raise my kids like this when my husband has no interest in it. I don't know what my next direction is. And she was so sweet because she would talk about this faith prayer. Like, let me walk you through this faith prayer. Like, a faith prayer is hop over your circumstances right now and start thanking God for how he's already worked out your situation.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
so good.
So I worked with her a lot. And so, she said, come back next week and tell me your impossible dream. And so I came back next week and I said, the furthest thing from what could happen right now, I think, would be, Lord, please make Brian a pastor, because I felt like he was so far from that. And so she said, great, that's your faith prayer. Like, you hop over what's happening right now and you start thanking God right now for him being a pastor. And I said, you are wackadoodle. Like, this cannot happen. I was a new Christian, so I didn't have a whole lot of rear view mirror stuff to look back on and say, oh yeah, God got me through that with that, God got me through that one. I didn't have a lot of that. So I really had to go on being humble and being faithful and just being obedient, really, to what God calls us to do. And it's really lay everything in his hands.
Yeah.
And so once I started letting go of that, things started moving. And it wasn't quick, but I kept being a good listener during that time.
Yeah. So
and I don't want you to take anything away from yourself either, Linda, because while all of that's true, part of what changed in that day when you agreed to not go to church is you began to be the wife, in my eyes at least, that any man would want to be married to. Mm. And so where there was some sassiness and there was some, well, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do, and you're not here most of the time anyway. So that began to change, where I began to see you putting me and my needs and desires ahead of your own, which actually made you Christ-like now in hindsight. I wasn't understanding what was happening, but the church became less of a threat. Mm-hmm. And
yeah, that's good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Excuse us, Gina.
We'd now like to kiss, please.
Talk amongst yourselves. Get a room. Just kidding. Yeah. So now that was a turning point that weekend, and you are meeting with this group now that is accepting you where you're at,
right.
Accepting your jerky questions and your good questions, your snarky responses and your good responses. So then what?
Then I think, for me at least, I think it was just kind of a slow evolution. It was it was talking to people. It was understanding. Again, I was not a non-believer.
Yeah.
But it was trying to understand what belief meant.
Yeah.
And why it meant that. And when you, at least for me, I'll be the first to say I have a pride problem. I'm comfortable in my own skin. Sometimes in ways I shouldn't be. And I just felt like I kind of got it, like I knew it, like how hard can this be? And so there was a lot of my own reading, and there was a lot of going to people that for whatever reason I had respect for that helped me. And there were, some books that were hugely impactful in my life. There were some people that were hugely impactful in my life. And then there was patience.
Yeah.
And I just needed patience. For me, belief always existed. However, the significance of that didn't hit until years later.
Yeah.
And so I always talk about, Linda was a light switch on off. For me, it was a dimmer switch.
Yeah, that's really good. That's a really good analogy. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just needed that slow, steady, loving pressure to make the light burn brighter and brighter and brighter.
Yeah, and I think that the more you learn about yourself before Christ, like how he individually made you, you can then recognize that being different is good, and that you each have your own journey in Christ. And so for me, I might be a visual learner and a feeling learner and a tactile learner. Like I, want to go out in the woods and read the Bible, or I want to, have pictures of Bible verses. I'll read a Bible verse and I can imagine it in my head. He is not that kind of learner at all.
Yeah.
So all the stuff that I was trying to give him, like, oh, listen to this message, oh, read this book, he was like, not getting it, doesn't mean anything to me.
Yeah.
He's a complete intellectual learner, and so once he found his authors and style, then he could kind of take it on his own. I think that was
and once you stop trying to control his process, then he could.
Yeah, and I mean, I think something else, we didn't recognize it then, but now when we meet with police couples, we recognize that the authority figure, it's really hard for officers to hand their life over to another authority, as in God, because you're kind of taught to be your own authority. And Brian can speak to this better than I can, but we came to a kind of a light bulb moment where it was like, wow, that's hard for you, because the academy training teaches you, like, you're the one in control. You're the one that's going home today. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit about how hard or difficult,
Yeah, from week one, exactly. You're taught to, you assess the scene. You have about half a second. You make a decision on what you're seeing, and then you take control. And when you take control, you do it firmly, quickly, and you don't relinquish it until you leave.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons I think police marriages suffer so much, is because I think, people enter into this union having a vision of what that's going to look like. And the vision doesn't often match reality, especially as officers get more and more seasoned in their careers, because they take more control, they have more success, and so suddenly they've got this endless OODA loop, or this cycle that takes them through something that is successful everywhere except in their house.
Wow.
And they come and they try to dominate and control their wife, they dominate and control their children, and suddenly that starts to go sideways, and it's like, why is this not working here? It works everywhere else.
Wow.
But yeah, it's funny when you're at a 30,000 foot level, and you're looking at others that you think are maybe at a 10,000 foot level, and you're thinking, oh man, you can't say that to her.
Yeah.
I mean, you can, but it's not going to go well.
Right.
There's, I can predict this is going to be bad.
Yeah.
And I'm not clairvoyant. I don't see into the future very well, but that's going to not work.
Yeah. Wow. Why don't you just talk a little bit about mentoring couples and your passion for marriage, and kind of where that came from, and what is that in you that is...
Yeah. Definitely being refined in different areas in our marriage did kind of propel us into wanting to care for marriages, because not that we have all the answers, but we've been through a lot. So a lot of things don't surprise us. It really started with us lay counseling at Saddleback Church. Having a couple in front of me as an individual lay counselor, and the gentleman happened to be a police officer. And so although I was using the same scripts and the same tactics and the same tools that we had learned through our counseling class, it was literally just bouncing off of him. Like, I could tell there was just a complete wall up with him. And so when you lay counsel there, you get supervised once a week. So I went to my supervisor and I said, hey, next week, do you think I could bring Brian in? He was already counseling men. And they said, yeah, it's a great idea. Like, you're counseling a police officer, he's a police officer. I think there might be a good match.
Yeah.
And so the next week I brought Brian in, and it was just like magic happened in front of us.
Wow. Like,
wheels began to turn, things began to make sense. He was able to speak his language, and it was just like, it just happened all in front of my eyes. And from that point forward, I thought, we have a good thing going. We can talk to marriage as well. Like, we have a really great way of building rapport with this couple. And they actually ended up doing very well at the end of our sessions. We probably saw them another 5 to 8 times and worked through some really tough stuff. And then there were moments where Brian would have to bring him into another room, and they would have a session by themselves for like 20 minutes, and I would meet with the woman for 20 minutes, and then we would all come back together. And that also gave us the idea that a lot of men just don't have other men to talk to. Men don't have men to mentor them. Men don't have men to help these guys lead marriages, which is what the wife really wants.
Yeah.
But the disconnect is in that leadership component can't take place out of nothing.
Right.
We have to teach that leadership component,
Right.
and that leadership component is best taught to a man by a man.
Yeah.
It just is the way it is. And so that worked out so beautifully that we started doing counseling marriages together.
Yeah, the men counseling men thing I think is interesting. We need a ball to be able to talk with any depth. And
Yeah.
even then, somebody drops the ball and the whole subject changes.
Yeah.
Or, the women I've seen in my life can sit down over a cup of coffee or a tea and really go crazy places that men would take years to get.
Yeah.
So, we'll grab a football or a golf ball or a fishing pole, and then you can start to have some of that conversation, which is really how I experienced relationship in my non-professional life. At the same time, I had been introduced to a form of police psychology by a psychologist, Larry Blum, who's a dear friend. And at first I was a little skeptical, and as I got to see how it worked, I was kind of blown away. And what it is our police department had a team of officers, and I was fortunate to be a part of that team, that anytime an officer had something traumatic, a shooting, a baby pass away in his or her arms, the team would get called in, and we would help that officer deal with their post-traumatic stress or the potential of them developing post-traumatic stress. And it was just kind of a life-changing and eye-opening experience that got me to the point where I really began to value certain aspects of the psychological sciences.
Yeah.
So I had done that forever, and Linda, when she, I was working nights again, and to fill her time, she was taking some counseling classes at church. And she would come back, and when we talked, she'd say, I think you would really like this. This is what I learned tonight, and you should see this. And she had a book, and I looked through the book, and I'm like, yeah, this is right in my wheelhouse. I would love this. So when I got off nights, I then took the class, and then we started counseling. And I loved it. And I also loved the difference between secular counseling and Christian counseling.
Yeah.
And I think there's value in both, although I personally have a much higher value for Christian counseling, because secular counseling often asks you, how does that make you feel? And Christian counseling says, well, it's interesting you feel that way, but what does the Bible say about what you're doing or how you're feeling or what your reaction is?
Right.
And I think the Bible, for me at least, it just gives a clearer and more precise worldview on how we should be behaving and treating each other.
Yeah.
And when I was going through the classes, and then especially when Lynn and I began to counsel each other, I began to see some of the chinks in my own armor. Because here I am counseling a couple, and I'm saying, bro, you can't say that to your wife and expect that to work. I mean, come on. Realizing as I'm saying that, gosh, I had said the same thing to my wife 2 weeks prior.
Yeah.
And so I began to verbalize things in a way that I was hearing them and realizing that I can be a better husband. I can be a better father. I can be a better everything. I can be a better friend, a better son, a better everything.
Yeah.
And so going through that counseling and then putting skin on it or actually using the exercises and giving people advice made me want to be the person that I was counseling from.
Yeah.
Meaning, because the people looked at Linda and I like we had it all together.
Right.
Well, yeah, you guys have it easy. I mean, you're married to Mr. Wonderful and you're married to Mrs. Wonderful. Well, it wasn't true, because we would go home and fight, and we would go home and have those rough moments like all couples do. And so I think what counseling in that environment taught us to do was argue better,
Yeah.
because we still disagree. We have something going on in our lives right now, or mostly it's my life, where somebody who I love tremendously, has essentially told me that love is not enough, that they need me to approve of everything they're doing, and the choices that they're making, and also the way that they're living. And I think, wow, I don't approve of everything my wife does. Right? I mean, we talk about those things and we dialogue about them, and we work hard to make each other better.
Yeah.
And sometimes, even though I don't approve of what Linda's doing, we talk about it and we come to a resolution, and we're a better couple and a stronger couple because of it.
Right.
And to demand that, well, no, you have to think exactly the way I think, and you have to approve of everything I do, that's not a relationship.
No. And that's not spiritual leadership either.
No.
Right.
Which I think is a big thing in Christian marriages, is the
submission model is way messed up.
Yeah, the submission model
In
and
churches.
and the distorted definition of what spiritual leadership in the home means. Or
Absolutely.
the head of the household is.
Right. I mean, fast forward where we met you, Gina, at that church, we, because our kids were there, we reluctantly left Saddleback because we left our lay counseling ministry that we were doing there, but quickly met the psychologist on staff at the new church, and she was familiar with the training that we had undergone at Saddleback, and so we began to counsel marriages under her tutelage and with her prescribed curriculum, and it became a class, and we started to run that class kind of like how we were comfortable meeting with marriages. So we started out together, and then we separated the men and the women because we felt like that model was really working out fantastically, and then we bring them back together again. And so through that, we kind of had to have our own way to talk about the submission model, because we found that a lot of the counseling that we did and a lot of the couples that we met with, that maybe was their primary problem.
Yeah.
And you would get rigid responses from both the man and the woman because they were at a stalemate and they didn't know how to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And the woman had stopped doing everything because, well, he wasn't leading.
Right.
And he had stopped doing everything because he said, well, she's always gone at church, so why should I? She doesn't even want to be home. Why should I do anything? And so, like, Brian and I had to really talk about how are we going to define this for these couples so that we can make some breakthroughs, and so that it is biblically based, but it also makes sense to them, and it can get them to the next step, like make a breakthrough, break the chain. And you have a really good way of kind of describing that to couples.
But yeah, so what we talk about, and again, it's trying to put things in language that people understand.
Yeah.
And so what we talk about in the submission model is that, obviously we are the bride of Christ, and we're supposed to treat our spouse as men the way Christ loved the church. And what did Christ do for the church? He died for the church.
Yeah.
And so we're supposed to put the other first. And so the way we visualize that for people in simple terms is, if you and your wife are in disagreement, that's okay. So have that discussion. Do it politely. Do it respectfully. But at the end of the night, we're not supposed to go to bed in anger if we can avoid that. But at the end of the night, somebody has to make a decision so that there can be peace in the home.
Yeah.
And so, husband, I'm asking you make the decision, but the decision I'm asking you to make is the one that benefits your wife.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, because that's what we're called to do. We're called to be sacrificial.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that's a difficult thing for a lot of couples to do.
Right.
Yeah.
We get a lot of raised eyebrows during that time. Because I think that these couples believe that it should be much more strict than that.
Yeah.
It should be much more rigid than that. That's not exactly the way it should be. It can't be that easy. And it actually, when it is that easy, it starts this really cool snowball, effect that runs down the hill, and it picks up speed, and the wife then wants to respect her husband even more, and the husband then wants to love his wife in different ways, and it just creates this continual really cool flow in the marriage. And I think that's what we're called to do. And I mean, we love meeting with couples. That's just one example of where we've seen light bulbs turn on within couples. And I don't know, I feel like we've been equipped through our struggles and our pain and our just even raising kids and getting through finances and getting through illnesses, that we've been able to really identify with a lot of these couples and walk them through to a beautiful new understanding of each other.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's been amazing. We've seen that's another way to see miracles.
Yeah.
So there's the miracle of healing, and there's the miracle of healing.
Yeah.
Some of those are physical, and some of those are emotional.
Yeah. Well, thanks, guys.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
Our pleasure. My pleasure.
Wow, there was a lot in that episode, and I can imagine that a lot of things were stirred up. If you are in a marriage that's unequally yoked, or if you're in a marriage that's struggling right now and wrestling through pain and hurt and distance, I just want to encourage you, if there were things that triggered you during this episode, to not recoil and get offended and let bitterness and resentment and frustration settle in, but to stop. To go before the Lord, to say, Jesus, show me, speak to me. What is it that you are trying to say? And let him speak to you. He never brings shame or condemnation or accusation. He brings an invitation for healing, for restoration, and for hope. Thank you for joining us. If you want more information about Brian and Linda Seitz and their ministry, you can visit them at peaksandvalleys.life. If you want more information about the Sacred Space podcast and Stockton Ministries, you can visit us at inthesacredspace.com or gina@ginastockton.com. And if you would be so kind as to take a moment and rate and review us on iTunes, that would be amazing, because that would help more people discover the Sacred Space. Thank you so much. Have a great week.